There are boss fights which are so impactful that they become the main event of their game. But sometimes a boss goes even further, it transcends its own game and shapes the future of its developers. 7th Force is one of those. If you've watched my last video, you probably saw this one coming. I'll take every opportunity I can to talk about Studio Treasure, and after declaring Gunstar Heroes their debut title as part of the general gaming education, I had to make another video about them. In case you have seen the video I recommended last time about the history of Treasure, then you already know how risky it was to found this studio. It consisted of former Konami employees led by Masato Maegawa, and they got tired of producing sequel after sequel, which might sound funny in today's gaming environment. They were eager to create something new, so they left Konami, worked on a game concept and looked for a publisher to fund their project. They approached, presented a concept for Gunstar Heroes, and were rejected. Sega just didn't see the sales potential for a game like that. This was a huge setback, but Maegawa and his team weren't finished. Instead, they created a prototype to showcase their vision, and after the next meeting with Sega, they had a signed contract and funding for their game. Their success had two major reasons. One was the condition that next to Gunstar Heroes, Treasure also needed to work on an additional title that Sega requested. This was McDonald's Treasure Land Adventure, which is surprisingly good. I will not go as far as recommending it to you, but if for whatever reason you are looking for the best game related to fast food franchises, then this is a hot contender. However, whenever I see Ronald McDonald, a certain video comes to my mind, which keeps haunting me. The second reason to fund Gunstar Heroes is that Sega was blown away by the prototype and could now see the sales potential. And allegedly, the one thing they were most impressed with was 7th Force. This boss is one of the key factors that made the game and Studio Treasure a reality. In a way, it might be the most important boss they ever designed. You could even say that it holds historic significance for Treasure. And that story alone makes it a worthy subject for today's video. So let's have a closer look at that boss fight and see how it might have convinced the folks at Sega. When you start up Gunstar Heroes, you enter Stage Select with 4 options. One of these leads you to 7th Force, so if you want to, you can have it as your first boss. Which is not advisable, because this fight is hard. But if you don't know better, you might be tempted to select this level first, because it features one character that was prominently shown in the intro cutscene. Green is the former ally that betrayed your player character. The other stages include one of the generals of the evil empire you are fighting, but here with Green you have a personal score to settle. I recommend to wait with that until you clear 2 of the other levels, because each time you finish a stage, your health gets upgraded. It is displayed as a number in the top left corner, and you start out with 100, but each beaten level adds 20 to your score, which is a significant upgrade. With 140 health you have a much higher chance to beat 7th Force. You might be asking, why not tackle 7th Force last and have a whopping 160 health? Well, because there's this strange fortress and you'll need as much health as you can get here. Not because of its boss, it is way easier than 7th Force, but the level features a rather infamous section in which you roll a dice and move over the board game. It is filled with tough challenges and fights, like the fearsome minion soldier, or the impressively harmless melon bread. The creativity of this level is off the charts, there's so much to discover here. However, to get through this board game setup you need to learn a lot of patterns and tricks, and that will burn through your health points. That's why you should choose this level last. Still, what an amazing concept. Gunstar Heroes was released in 1993. That's 24 years before Cuphead. So 7th Force isn't the only amazing thing you can find in these levels. In fact, they all have something special to offer. You might be surprised how quickly the game moves from one interesting encounter to the next. And this is supported by the innovative weapon system. There are 4 different guns and you can always carry 2 and switch freely between them. You can also combine your weapons to create a new shot type, and this is where the game gets really interesting. For example, Here I have the Chaser and Lightning Gun equipped, and when combined it creates this beam that zips over the screen and automatically targets enemies. With this shot type you don't have to aim at all, which is especially useful if enemies are hard to hit otherwise. This is the weapon I recommend for your first playthrough, because most of the time you can just fire and forget, and instead focus on dodging enemies and learning patterns. Damage-wise it is not the most powerful. For that I would advise combining Chaser and Fire. This results in a devastating fireball that you have to manually move around the screen. Tricky to control, but very rewarding. And a creative idea for a weapon, this almost feels like its own game mode. Although my favorite combination is Fire and Lightning. It creates this short-range laser sword which deals a lot of damage. The downside is obvious. You have to get in to hit enemies, but to make that easier, the laser sword also allows you to deflect projectiles. This leads into a very agile playstyle in which you use your weapon's offensive and defensive capabilities at the same time. And there are many other combinations to discover, which really amps up the replay value. All in all, Gunstar Heroes is fantastic and there's so much more I could show you, but we are here for 7th Force, so let's finally enter its level. It immediately becomes apparent that this stage follows its own rules. You are in a kind of auto-scroller and you drive on this modified minecart. It comes with one special ability. When you double tap jump, it somehow rotates around and gravitates towards the ceiling. It can be reversed with another double jump input. This lets you perform wild maneuvers to dodge the projectiles on screen. And in the later half it can easily get turbulent with all the enemies that swarm you. There is also variation in which the tunnel leads downwards and you slide on the walls on the side. All of this fuels the excitement on having these high-speed gunfights. Near the end, there's also a bit in which reoccurring villain Smash Daisaku fights you by throwing soldiers from a train that is about to explode. Yes, seriously, a guy called Smash Daisaku throws minor enemies at you while the train he is riding is exploding. What a cool guy. The whole level is not that long, but it provides you plenty of opportunity to get used to controlling your minecart, which is important because you'll fight 7th Force in this mode. This already makes the fight gimmicky, but trust me, you haven't seen anything yet. After an irritatingly long boss introduction, you meet Green on his flying platform, which then transforms into a giant robot, and this is what you have to fight. The whole setup is spectacular. A huge robot chases you through this high-speed tunnel and you dodge its attacks by switching between the ceiling and the ground. There is some variation in its patterns and you need to look out for visual indicators to predict its attacks. All the while you shoot it with your preferred gun and slowly reduce its health. If you should be wondering what might be so special about that, then I want to focus your attention on the robot itself. For a game of the 16-bit era, this is a rather smooth animation. Why does this matter? Well, this was the 90s, so we were in the middle of the console wars between Sega and Nintendo. Sega, as the underdog, did everything they could to present their console as the superior one. This is why there were all these aggressive marketing campaigns.
What if you don't have blast processing?
However, while the Sega Genesis actually had a faster processor, the Super Nintendo offered a lot of other advantages that made their games eye-catchers. One of the most famous is Mode 7, which allows to tinker with the background layer. It can be rotated and rescaled, which creates a bunch of memorable effects, some of which even looked like it was a three-dimensional animation. Later in the console's lifetime, Nintendo added the Super FX chip to some games, which allowed similar effects with sprites. It looked really impressive for its time. By the way, I love this fight, but Yoshi's Island is a story for another day. The Sega Genesis didn't have functionalities like that on board. You couldn't just tell the console to rotate objects. If you wanted to have animations like this, well, then you had to animate them yourself. And how did Treasure make that possible? If you look closely, you can notice that 7th Force doesn't consist of one sprite, but rather of multiple single objects. It is a multi-jointed construction with a lot of repeating elements, and each of these is individually processed. So this is not just one animation, but rather the result of all of these objects moving and getting replaced by slightly rotated versions of themselves. This technique and the whole fight with 7th Force is the brainchild of Hideyuki Suganami, one of the former Konami employees that followed Maegawa when he founded Treasure. While the team was working on a prototype that would eventually convince Sega to sign a contract, Suganami spent 1 whole month in which he exclusively worked on 7th Force, and these smooth animations that looked way better than what most other games had to offer were the result. But that wasn't all Suganami achieved in this 1 month. And when you finally reduced the boss's health to 0, you could see what else it had in store for you. Just like we saw in the preceding level, the direction you are driving in has changed and the character now slides upwards while the boss transformed into its second form. 7th Force is a multi-phase boss fight, and the second form is radically different. It's called Urgent Force. The first one was named Soldier Force, and it looks like a giant saw blade which you should avoid at all cost. It bounces from one wall to the other and sometimes dashes up or down, and these moments can get pretty nerve-wracking. When it moves towards you, you have to react fast, otherwise it crashes into you, so you need to focus on the cues for its behavior. This goes on for a while, but at a certain point Urgent Force alters its strategy. It spins around and shoots these plasma balls. You have to adjust your positioning accordingly and find safe spots to shoot it. The spinning graphics are remarkable, as well as its movement earlier. It looks very elaborate, and the smooth and sometimes even spatial looking animations surpass what we have seen with Soldier Force, at least in my opinion. Okay, so gameplay wise you have to adapt to these new patterns and have to deplete the boss's health a second time. But eventually you will manage that, and then there's another phase. 7th Force isn't just any multi-phase boss, it might be the most iconic multi-phase fight of the 16-bit era. Back then, having bosses that got up for an additional round and completely changed their pattern were a rarity. That's what makes 7th Force stick out with even 3 forms. But as you might have suspected, we are not done after this one neither. In total, 7th Force has 7 forms, and each one is vastly different than the one before. And not only that, it doesn't just cycle through its phases in a set order, there's also a random element. You always start with Soldier Force, and next to that form there are 3 other variations that move sideways too. The remaining ones take place on the vertical version of the level. After each defeated form, the direction you're driving in changes, so after Soldier Force, one of the 3 vertical forms is randomly selected. After that you fight one of the 3 horizontal versions, then one of the 2 remaining verticals, and so on. This dynamic approach results in vastly different experiences. Beating all the forms on your first bout is very tough, so you will most likely have to try again. In that case, you face off with Soldier Force once more, but afterwards the order is random and you might have to fight a phase you didn't even see on your first try. Each fight might have a different order, and the moment 7th Force transforms is always tense. Over time you will gain preferences. Some forms will feel easy, while others will cause you problems. I personally have an easy time with Eagle and Tiger Force. They feel methodical, especially Eagle plays out like a puzzle. And Tiger is somehow easy to read for me. On a good day I take no damage from them at all. But on a bad day, Crab Force can single-handedly steal all my life. In concept it is simple, you just have to switch between the ceiling and the ground. But correctly predicting where you are safe, while quickly reacting to its tells, all of that can easily overwhelm me. Usually when I make 1 or 2 mistakes in a row, I completely lose the rhythm and then only luck can get me through. At least it's not as bad as Tails Force. I think most people will not have that many problems here, but for some reason I always find myself cornered and take a lot of damage. This one can go wrong very fast, and it's always the most critical phase for me. Not knowing when which form arrives adds a lot to the tension. Getting 2 of your most hated variations one after the other can be too much, but if you get a couple of the easier ones in between, you can collect yourself, and that can make the difference between winning and losing. And this variety gets even more extreme if you take difficulty settings into account. When you play the game on hard or extreme, you will fight all of the 7 forces. But on normal you just have to face 5, and on easy only 3. All 7 forms are still available in these modes and they get randomly selected. So if I'm playing on normal, I can get lucky and don't have to fight Tails or Crab, which makes winning much more likely for me. This also boosts the replay value and might even be a reason to try out hard mode. And if you do, I recommend Lightning and Chaser as your weapon combination, because it lets you focus on dodging and some of the forms are hard to hit with most of the other weapons. I absolutely adore this fight. But even if you're not convinced, you might still agree that it is a very intriguing concept. Having so many radically different forms and choosing them somewhat randomly, this is what cemented this fight as one of the greatest of its time for me. From a game design perspective, this boss keeps offering cool stuff, and that's how it convinced me. However, I'm not sure how crucial this aspect was when Treasure and Sega had that fateful meeting. I think it was the technical side of this fight that impressed Sega the most. Not only did the different phases load in quickly, but they all had something visually appealing to offer. I already talked about the impressive rotations, and for that we can also have a look at Blaster Force, this giant gun which begins to spin around when it needs to reload. But if we have a closer look, we can also identify another trick that its creator Suganami used to make this fight possible. If we compare Blaster and Soldier Force, then we can see that both use the same objects as their components. They have different color palettes, and Soldier also has this hat which is not used for the gun. But apart from that, it is the same set of sprites that is used to assemble these forms. And this is true for all of the 7 forces. Each has their own color scheme and the amount of components changes, but they all use the same parts. Suganami didn't just create this elaborate technique of jointing together the single sprites, he also showcased 7 different ways to use it. In a way, 7 Force is a tech demo, a demonstration of pretty animations that are made possible by cleverly playing around with what the hardware has to offer. That alone might already have been enough to get funding for Gunstar Heroes, but Suganami didn't stop there, but instead integrated this tech demo into a boss fight. It's not just here to create advanced visuals, it also innovates in game design. Each form challenges the player in a different way. The patterns are so distinct that they are hardly comparable, and on top of that there is the semi-randomized order in which you fight them. This is impressive. It certainly impressed me when I first played Gunstar Heroes in the mid-2010s, more than 20 years after its release. It is Suganami's stroke of genius, how he used the single parts, assembled the different forms and animated them by moving the individual pieces around. This is what strings the whole fight together. With that, he created these amazing visuals, but also designed the gameplay around it. Shifting and altering the single pieces to create cohesive movement, that is what most forms use for their attacks, even if they also shoot out projectiles. And this is also what happens in the game's universe. 7 Force isn't just 7 bosses in a row, it is always the same robot that reassembles its parts and attacks by creatively combining the movement of the single pieces. It tries to overpower you by reconstructing itself on the fly and changing its strategy. Think about it. In universe, 7 Force does the same thing that Suganami did in our world to design this outstanding boss. And that's why it belongs into the general gaming education. So now that you know all that, my job is done. However, if you are interested, you can get even more insights on the backstory of this fight in this article by John Harrison. You can find the link in the description. It is part of his book Legend of 16-bit Game Development, which I can wholeheartedly recommend. And maybe I managed to transfer some of the fascination of 7 Force onto you. If that's the case, then why don't you give Gunstar Heroes a try? The game has much more to offer, and while I certainly spoiled this fight for you, there's more about 7 Force to discover. Not only in Gunstar Heroes, it also has a guest appearance in the marvelous Alien Soldier. And it has a homage in a top secret title, which I will not reveal today. But if this whole run and gun shooter thingy isn't your cup of tea, then try out another Treasure game if you haven't already. 7 Force might be the most important boss fight they ever created, but Treasure put many more extraordinary ideas into their games. So have a look at their catalog and you might find something to your liking. Anyway, thank you very much for watching. I will leave Treasure as a topic for now, so next time I will show you something completely different. Stay tuned.